Tony is the only person, I think, and certainly the only art dealer, well, the only person that I ever threw out of my studio.
Really, why?
I remember a point where just to even be in a group show with, a few other people. I remember being in a group show with Barbara Kruger and Richard Prince in Amsterdam in 1980 and thinking, wow, now this is beginning to make sense to me. Like I'm finally in a group of artists that I identify with. And it's a slow process to getting to the point where, where you're in a position to do that. But that, all of us have been for a long time. Whatever it was, Friday night, everybody would be out on the streets, and these minute little galleries would be jam-packed, and people just crowded outside them on the street and going from one place to another. But it was a very, how can I say it? It was a very self-generated scene. It was artists making spaces for artists. They had opened up these little storefront galleries, partly because they were so cheap and they could curate the shows themselves. And so it was a very lively, dynamic scene, no matter which galleries you found interesting. And Gracie is from a series called Objects of Desire, which is from 1981, and well, that particular one, where I took the clothes off of models. When I talk about deconstructing, I took leather jackets and brides' dresses and satin evening gowns and mini skirts, and took almost like paper dolls in reverse, took advertisements and took the clothes off and tried to, well, I made a series of works that were reproduced photographically, very lush cibachromes, red and black, and I tried to make them extremely seductive, and the reason being that I was trying to talk about sexuality and gender, and what are these postures, what are these positions, what are these attitudes that precede any individual tough guy who wears the leather jacket, or innocent bride, and talk about these positions, these attitudes that one can either fall in love with or adopt and become, the sexy girl in the miniskirt, or reject any of the above. I set them up as positions. I just mentioned to you before that I had been very influenced by conceptual art, and I think for me, part of my project, or the main part of my project, was really to understand how photography, to engage photography as a language. In other words, to understand how we talk it, how we picture the world through it, how we orient ourselves to the universe through photography. And I felt like as I mentioned to you before, that I was living in a world of images, and I tried to make my artwork as though I were exploring this world, and almost like a Alice in Wonderland. What is this strange world of pictures that I live in, and how do they affect me? How do they affect us? And we speak this language. We're surrounded by it. Our sense of history, our sense of art history, our sense of the moon and outer space and under the sea is all informed through photography. So my work has been really a lot about exploring that world. And as I said before, I worked for many years using images from popular culture, and I just imagined myself as they're mine, and I never related to the word appropriation because I wasn't interested in stealing images. I rather took them apart. There used to be a term that was used a lot, deconstruction. It was like really about taking apart these things, finding out what they're made of, and how they function, and how they picture the world for us. And at a certain point, the concept of a critical practice was very important. I think, you know, coming from this kind of political point in the 70s, the idea of art as a way of talking to and back to the world, that it, you know, also coming from feminism, that, you know, we saw ourselves as inheriting certain kinds of languages, certain kinds of ideas of self that were repressive or were, you know, that needed to be changed, needed to be challenged, needed to be addressed. And when I first started to go to shows in the late 60s and early 70s, when I first came to New York and was in college, the art world was minuscule. There were like 4 galleries, and it was possible to see pretty much every show. And the 70s were very political. There was a lot of discussion about art. There was a lot of group activities. There was a lot of kind of critical work, writing and reading and talking. And I think that it was a very serious period, shall we say. And, you know, it was in response to coming out of the Vietnam War and feminism, and, you know, it was a very intellectual period. The 80s, by comparison, you know, there's no particular point it started, but I started showing in the early 80s, when exactly, like 82 or 83, I started to show with, no, 83, with International, with Monument, which was one of the galleries in the East Village, and in my opinion, the most interesting one of the East Village. And even in the East Village period, which was from the early to the late mid 80s, there were different camps going on there. There was the kind of graffiti fun gallery. Pat Hearn, even, you know, much more related to painting and related to graffiti and related to just kind of fluff and fun. And there were 1 or 2 galleries that were more intellectual and more critical, and International with Monument was one of those. And, you know, there were great artists that showed there. And Peter Halley had his first show there, and Richard Prince showed there, and Jeff Koons showed there, and what?
Is that Mayor Weissman too?
Mayor Weissman. There were 3 of them: Ken Klayman, Liz Curry, and Meyer Weissman. And they had a fabulous gallery, just top-notch. They did incredible shows. And Nature Mort was a gallery Peter Nagy had, which was also really, really interesting gallery. Tiny little storefront, big as a closet, and they did incredible shows. And Jay Gorney had a very interesting gallery, and Cash Gallery, which was Oliver Wassa, was the other one that I sort of supported. And so even at that period, you know, every, whatever it was, Friday night, everybody would be out on the streets, and these minute little galleries would be jam-packed, and, you know, people just crowded outside them on the street and going from one place to another. But it was a very, how can I say it? It was a very self-generated scene. It was artists making spaces for artists. They had opened up these little storefront galleries, partly because they were so cheap and they could curate the shows themselves. And so it was a very lively, dynamic scene, no matter you know, which galleries you found interesting, and Gracie Mansion and Fun and all those, which perhaps was a response to the lack of galleries in the preceding period. There were very, very few, as I said, in the 70s. And so when galleries started opening up in the 80s in the East Village, and it became a very dynamic, interesting, you know, quick, down-to-earth situation, it immediately became a sort of center of attention. And I remember slowly, immediately slowly, there began to be collectors coming to these openings and beginning to people these galleries, and work began to be sold. And then there were limousines waiting outside these Lower East Side galleries, and then more and more work being sold, and then dealers from Europe coming, and magazine articles being written, and something that had started as a very sort of underground, fast, artist-run, cheap situation became very commercial. And it wasn't that it went commercial, it wasn't that the galleries sold out, it was that it was like a really exciting period and good art was being made and it started to sell. And collectors knew that it was a place to come and see great stuff. And then the money started to come in, galleries from Soho. It was that period where International with Monument was sold by Meyer Weissman to Elan Wingate. Meyer, who was a brilliant strategist and very creative businessman, managed to go from being a dealer. He had sort of transitioned almost overnight to being an artist, had had 1 or 2 shows with Jay Gorney, and apparently sold incredibly well and had an enormous waiting list right away. And people were always quoting waiting list numbers, or not everybody, but there's a lot of talk about waiting lists in those days. And Meyer managed to situate himself, position himself in such a way as to sell his art gallery and get himself a show and take along some of the most successful and powerful of the artists that emerged from that situation. So Meyer, along with Peter Halley and Jeff Koons, and I can't remember who else, was it Ashley Bickerton, became the Neo Geo artists and had their first Soho show at Sonnabend. I think that was around 86, maybe, something like that. And that was the beginning of that period that you're talking about, where, and at that point, Peter Nagy and I joined Jay Gorney, who had set up a Soho gallery, and the International with Monument was sold to Elan Wingate, and Elan bought the gallery for the stable of artists and found that the stable had left. There was no stable. Without Meyer, there was nobody, left to hold the situation together.
Doesn't he want to work for Larry Gagosian now?
No, he works for Larry Gagosian, yeah. Elan and Liz Curry had a gallery for a while. I think they changed the name to Curry Wingate, but the only artist that I remember that remained, General Idea, actually. General Idea had been with. My first real New York gallery show was with Tony, but that was quite some time after the Guernica thing. I don't remember when the Guernica thing was, like 76 or something like that. And he was, at that point, he was an artist. Tony's background was an artist, he was an artist, and I remember reading about the Guernica thing, and I remember seeing Tony around the art world, but by the time I really got to know him, he was wanting to start an art gallery, and I guess was transitioning, wanting to be an art dealer. And I had a show with him in 1980, I think, that was giant blow-ups of people in midair. They were people jumping out of buildings trying to commit suicide, or people trying to save their lives, but they were all people in midair. And that show was at Tony's quote-unquote gallery, which was Tony's apartment with all the furniture in the closet. His apartment on Lexington Avenue was his first gallery. And that the Tony of the Guernica days was gone by then. Tony was wearing a suit and was trying to come on as quite the proper businessman.
He's got
Tony is the only person, I think, and certainly the only art dealer, well, the only person that I ever threw out of my studio.
Really, why?
Tony's a hothead. He's like a madman, and I think he has a great deal of passion about art, and I think the Guernica situation, was an expression of Tony's passion. But as an art dealer, it was very peculiar because he used to fight a lot with his artists because he tried to tell people what they should do. And I remember him coming to my studio once for a studio visit and saying, but you should do this like that, and this should be like that. And I kept saying, okay, shut up, I'm going to do it, And finally we got in a brawl, and I said, get out of here. I can't stand it. Just get out of my studio. And he was the only person that I think I ever did that with. But